Hi there, everybody. Welcome to this briefing on Palestine, Trump, the Labour government, and international law on UN International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People. This event is being hosted by Labour in Palestine and streamed by Arise Festival, a very timely event on the day designated for to internationally highlight the Palestinian people's ongoing struggles for liberation. Thank you all for joining us. To introduce myself very quickly, I'm Jess Barnard. I'm a member of the Labour National Executive Committee representing the members' voices on that body. I'm a trade unionist and a long-term international solidarity activist, and I had the incredible privilege of visiting Palestine on a delegation in 2022, where I saw for myself the system of apartheid and the daily impact of the illegal occupation on Palestinians, from children in refugee camps with no access to any outside green spaces, to meet students who are being stopped and searched every day on their way to access education held by the side of the road, to shopkeepers placed under house arrest and villagers being attacked and threatened and bullied into leaving their homes and witnessing their villages being demolished against international law. We meet at a vital time for all of us interested in justice for Palestine and at the height of what the ICJ has termed a plausible genocide. We also meet at a time where the UK Labour government has continually refused to heed the call to end all arms sales to Israel, and when Trump's return to the presidency promises no respite for the unrelenting US backing for apartheid Israel. So all current signs are that even now, aggressions and human rights abuses against the people of Palestine are intensifying, clearly acting against the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. So it's in this context, it's good to see so much support for the people of Palestine across our society, including the Labour movement and beyond, despite the disgraceful position of Labour's front bench, including through and a lot of interesting work of Labour in Palestine, with over 20,000 people from over 650 constituencies signing Labour in Palestine's petition to the Labour leadership, and nearly 10,000 people backing the recent call to end all arms sales to Israel. So I'm delighted to introduce a range of speakers with us today who will be putting that case forward for Palestine, and that more than ever, Palestine needs our solidarity. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our very first speaker, and I'm pleased to introduce Peter Leary of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jess. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say how great it was to see you on the steps of Downing Street earlier this week, taking that message, the call for an immediate end to all arms sales, directly to Keir Starmer. And thanks, of course, to Labour in Palestine and to Arise for inviting me to speak at this important and timely meeting, marking the UN Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, but coming also not long after the re-election of Donald Trump as President of the United States, opening a dangerous new period, well, for the planet, for everyone around the world who believes in the universal principles of justice and equality, but a threat that is particularly acute for the Palestinian people. And coming also, of course, a little over a week since the International Criminal Court finally issued arrest warrants for the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the former Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, for crimes against humanity and war crimes. For decades, this date, the 29th of November, served as a reminder of the enduring Palestinian struggle against settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, military occupation, and apartheid. This year, it arrives at probably the darkest moment in Palestinian history, as Israel's genocide continues unabated. For more than a year, the world has watched in horror as Israel rains down destruction upon the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, obliterating homes, schools, and hospitals, killing many tens of thousands and maiming many more. So, at the very least, as we are confronted with this ongoing genocidal onslaught, the belated decision of the ICC to issue these arrest warrants offers us a glimmer of hope for justice. Netanyahu is now a wanted man. publicly announcing its unprecedented decision, the pre-trial chamber of the ICC stated that there are reasonable grounds to believe that both men bear criminal responsibility for the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare, the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts, the war crime of intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population. Like all of us, the court has seen the evidence. Hospital patients burnt alive and doctors forced to perform operations, including the amputation of limbs, without access to anaesthetic. Having heard Gallant degrade Palestinians as human animals and Netanyahu invoke the biblical tribe of Amalek to call for their elimination, there can be little doubt that both men are guilty on every count. This announcement is a vindication of the millions who have marched and taken action to call for international law to be upheld. It is no less a damning indictment on those who have excused and continue to facilitate Israel's atrocities in Gaza. These ICC arrest warrants should mark a turning point. They place Britain in particular in the grotesque position of continuing to sell weapons and provide diplomatic cover to a regime that is not only on trial for genocide, but is led by a fugitive from international justice. Unfortunately, so far, the response from the British government has been woefully inadequate. Initially, the simple question whether they will be bound to uphold international law, and domestic law indeed, was dismissed as hypotheticals. And I'm sure Richard Burgon will say more on this as he was present, but those of us who had the displeasure, I suppose, of watching the debate in the House of Commons earlier this week will have seen Hamish Faulkner repeatedly fail to make the simple and clear statement that is needed, to make clear to Netanyahu and to Gallant in no uncertain terms that they will be arrested if they ever set foot in Britain. And of course, we know that that will not happen, nor indeed the end to arms sales and the other sanctions that are required, unless we continue to organise and build the solidarity movement, including our campaigns for boycott, divestment and sanctions. That is why throughout this week, PSC and our other partners have been organising, taking action to coincide with this International Day of Solidarity. On Wednesday, nearly 300 activists were in Parliament to pressure MPs to take meaningful steps to end Britain's complicity with Israel's crimes. Yesterday, we saw a workplace day of action with backing from the TUC and national trade unions, with workers and students mobilising to organise a wave of meetings and protests across Britain. Today, we are asking everyone to mark the day by putting a poster in your home or office window to show your solidarity and carry that message into every street and community. You can download a copy, maybe we can put it in the chat, or you can pick up one in the print edition of today's Morning Star. And of course, tomorrow we will take to the streets of London once again, assembling at 12 noon at Park Lane to march to Whitehall for what will be the 22nd National March for Palestine in what is already ranks as one of the largest and most sustained protest movement in British history. So this year, the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people is clearly needed as urgently as ever. Let us use it as a moment to reaffirm our commitment to the struggle for Palestinian rights. Join us tomorrow when we take to the streets, and let us all continue to escalate our actions until Palestine is finally free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks so much for joining us today. And that's a really tangible action for everybody on this call to take forwards to keep up that pressure and the visibility of Palestinians and Palestinian freedom and justice. So thank you so much. And thank you to the work you do at PSC in organising all of the demonstrations, which have been fundamental in keeping the pressure up and holding our government to account. So thank you, Peter. I'm going to move us on to our next speaker. We have a speaker from Warwick Students' Union, an officer for disabled students, and who is also on the Labour Students' National Committee. So I'm pleased to introduce Mads Wainman, who can talk to us a little bit about divestment campaigns at her campus and more. So over to you, Mads.
Hello. Thank you to Arise for inviting me back. It's a privilege to mark this year's International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people alongside you all. Obviously, Jess has just introduced me. I'm the Labour Students Disability Officer, a Momentum NCG member, but I am here in my capacity as Warwick Students' Union Disability Officer. So I will focus on student activism and the demilitarisation of education. But I first of all want to acknowledge all of the lives lost, not just since October 7th, but since 1948. It's a heartbreaking thing to acknowledge that the Nakba has not ended, but it is so important to remember that. The scale of loss and destruction is unfathomable, and every day that this genocide continues is unforgivable. And those responsible should be held to account. And I want to bring attention to Jess Barnard's stance against Starmer's continued involvement in these war crimes at the NEC drinks. Solidarity. In the face of no universities remaining in Gaza, I want to talk about how we can utilise our own universities today to bring about divestment. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign has found that UK universities have invested £430 million in companies complicit in the illegal actions of the Israeli government. Students have responded nationally with encampments and campaigns to pressure universities to divest. At Cambridge, Trinity College announced an end to investments in arms companies. King's College London halted investments in Israel's arms supplies, and Goldsmiths announced a review into its policies. Within my own university, students have organised for change. Warwick Stands with Palestine held a 60-day encampment, culminating in an 11-day occupation of a Warwick Manufacturing Group building. This was the first occupation of WMG, a department with ties to the arms trade through companies like BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce. The Warwick Student Staff Solidarity Network has published an investment in injustice, which I've previously promoted on this forum. It is a very thorough research proposal that was a joint student staff research collective. There's a 44-page document detailing the university's complicity in genocide, which is available as a PDF for free on the Warwick UCU website if you wish to read it in full. However, to give a brief overview, this report begins with a history of the occupation, from the origins of Zionism to the Nakba of 1948 to today. It then develops into a full and meticulous study into the University of Warwick's direct complicity with the arms trade and Israeli crimes. It was found that Warwick has accepted over £100 million in research funding from arms companies and fails to acknowledge the dual use of these contracts. This makes negotiations difficult, as Warwick claims its investments with companies are purely for scientific advancement, failing to recognise that these advancements will develop technology used in war crimes. For instance, the Computer Science Department has received £9 million of funding for a project developing technologies that could be adapted for autonomous weapon systems, alongside other contracts with dual use potential. WMG has a partnership with Airbus on Project Zest, a £19.5 million project, which is likely to have dual use applications in military transport, given that the company is one of the largest suppliers of advanced military aircraft. The engineering department is deeply complicit, as I'm sure you can imagine, but the largest issue for me personally is a project completed alongside BAE Systems, Airbus, Rafael Defence Systems, and Thales. Rafael Defence Systems is an Israeli company that promotes its products as combat proven, namely they are tested on Palestinians. According to the Student Staff Solidarity Network report, which most of this has been taken almost word for word from anyway, but the outcomes of this project could significantly enhance military capabilities across various platforms, such as enhancing the design and operation of military aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, and missile systems. Many of these contracts are covert, and the extensive level of research required students to work with staff to gain access to this information. The framework of utilising students and staff is essential, and hopefully the full PDF can demonstrate a methodology which is applicable to many other universities and institutions. These reports and actions have not yet been acted upon by the university. Warwick Stands with Palestine is entering negotiations with university management and the Vice-Chancellor Stuart Croft, and this report is able to provide transparency and accountability, greatly aiding these negotiations, which is why I implore every university to conduct similar research. However, there is still a sense of inaction and reluctance from the university. Every day that this genocide continues is unacceptable, and to be reluctant to act in the face of mass suffering is inhumane. Whether it's university chancellors or prime ministers, we must stand together and make our voices heard. We all know that solidarity is not transactional, it is essential, and there is real power in that. As Akwake Emezi has said in their novel Bitter, hope is something serious and deliberate instead of something wishful and desperate. The ability to practice hope is a privilege, but it is one we are afforded, so we must continue to hold hope that our efforts will not be in vain. Still, it is important to remember during the course of our work that this is human loss on an unprecedented scale, which is being felt by people quite often far away from us. While I have focused on student activism, hope, and what we can materially do as activists in the UK, I feel it is important to remember the devastation that is occurring right now in this Labour government's name. I therefore want to read out two pieces of writing that I personally find quite powerful. It's quite Gen Z of me that the first piece I have is a Tumblr post, but I do think you'll all agree it's moving and important. And I'm sure some of you have seen it. So, I wake up thirsty and I think of Palestine. I go to the doctor's office and I think of Palestine. A sign in the corner of the waiting room says this is a place of healing. Disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. And I think of Palestine. They probably weren't thinking of bombs and snipers and mass graves in parking lots. I call my parents and I think of Palestine. I drive to the grocery store and I think of Palestine. I look at the clear blue sky and I think of Palestine. I put the dishes away and I think of Palestine. I feed my cat and I think of Palestine. I listen to music and I think of Palestine. I read poetry and I think of Palestine. I text my friends and I think of Palestine. I think of Palestine and I think of Palestine and I think of Palestine. And now I will read Born on Nakba Day, a poem by Muhammad Al-Kurd. Your unkindness rewrote my autobiography into punchlines in guts, blades for tongues, a mouth pregnant with thunder. Your unkindness told me to push through, look, listen. I was born on the 50th anniversary of the Nakba to a mother who reaped olives and figs and other Quranic verses. Watini wa Zayatun. My name, a bomb in a white room, a walking suspicion in an airport, choiceless politics. I was born on the 50th anniversary of the Nakba. Outside the hospital rooms, protests, burnt rubber, fired faces, and bare bodies, stones thrown onto tanks, tanks imprinted with US flags, lands smelling of tear gas, skies tiled with rubber-coated bullets, a few bodies shot dead, died, numbers in a headline. I and my sister were born. Birth lasts longer than death. In Palestine, death is sudden, constant, instant, happens between breaths. I was born among poetry. On the 50th anniversary, the liberation chants outside the hospital room told my mother to push. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mads. That was a really, really powerful reading. And I know so many of us feel really inspired by the work of student activists who've been holding educational institutions to account. And the encampments last year winning a number of demands and divestment wins. So thanks so much for joining us today. And thank you for the work you're doing. I know so many of us are really, really inspired by it. And on that note, we've touched on BDS, something that all of us can and must continue to participate in. These small acts from us, but collectively can make a big material difference, and hitting complicit companies in their profits can hold them to account. But BDS is only effective when we work together and do that collaboratively. So I recommend following the work of the BDS National Committee. So I'm going to take us to our next speaker, who actually is going to be a video, because our next speaker was going to be Richard Burgon, who has, as many of you all know, done so much to bring Palestine and hold our government to account on issues of international law and raising the issues of sanctions. In Parliament, I know this week he has been relentless in amplifying the cause of the Palestinian people and holding the government to account. So I just want to take a minute to say thanks to Richard for all that he's doing on this and in other issues. And today, unfortunately, he is in Parliament for another very important debate you might have seen. So he has recorded this message for us earlier. So I'll hand over to the admins to play the message.
Hi, I'm sorry I can't be there live with you today. but there's a very important vote in Parliament on assisted dying, which I'm sure you understand I need to be in. So I'm recording this contribution on Thursday, the day before the United Nations Day Palestine. And I've just sent a letter that I organised with my colleague Imran Hussain to the Foreign Secretary. That letter has been signed by over 60 parliamentarians from 7 parties, calling on the Foreign Secretary to impose comprehensive sanctions on Israel. Words alone from our government are simply not enough. We need sanctions to stop Israel's war crimes and sanctions to force Israel to comply with international law. Now, last week, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, issued arrest warrants against the Israeli Prime Minister and the former Defence Minister for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, that alone should be enough for such sanctions. It's simply not legally or morally acceptable to carry on with business as usual with an Israeli leader facing an arrest warrant for war crimes. It's simply not justified to continue exporting fighter jet parts being used to kill Palestinian children, to an Israeli leader wanted for crimes against humanity. So I welcome that decision by the ICC to issue all the arrest warrants. Our government must support the ICC in its work, and it must enforce those arrest warrants. Now, earlier this year, alongside my colleague Imran Hussain MP, I actually visited the International Criminal Court in The Hague to submit a dossier of evidence on Israeli war crimes in Gaza. That evidence was compiled from a series of expert panels we organised in Parliament, attended by 70 parliamentarians from 8 parties. And what we heard during those sessions in Parliament was utterly horrific. So it's a simple matter of justice that every single individual responsible for the war crimes and crimes against humanity carried out during Israel's war on Gaza must be held to account. But there's recently been another huge development in international law too. Earlier this year, the world's top court, the International Court of Justice, found that the Israeli occupation as a whole, not just its current war crimes in Gaza, is illegal. And the court demanded it end as rapidly as possible. And very significantly, the court also said that all states have clear obligations under international law not to provide aid or assistance to Israel or to enter into economic or trade dealings that maintain this illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. So we've now got a situation where the 2 highest courts in the world in their fields, in the space of just a few months, are calling the dismantling of the illegal occupation and issuing arrest warrants for war crimes against Israel's leaders. Could there be a better example of a time when states should be imposing sanctions? And that's what our letter, signed by over 60 parliamentarians from 7 parties, demands. Of course, it calls for an arms embargo, including an end to those parts that end up in F-35 fighter jets sold to Israel and bombing Gaza with 2,000-pound bombs. But the letter goes further. It also calls for travel bans and asset freezes against all individuals and entities involved in maintaining Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. It also calls for a ban on trade with all illegal Israeli settlements. The government says that settlements are illegal, so why allow trade with them? It also calls for revoking the 2030 roadmap. Now, this is a special partnership the UK has with Israel that seeks to deepen UK-Israeli economic trade and security ties. How on earth can this be on the agenda? Deepening ties after war crimes, after crimes against humanity, after warnings of genocide. The phrase rewarding bad behaviour doesn't come close to covering the complete and sheer ludicrousness of this. Our letter also calls on the UK government to undertake a comprehensive review of all current trade, security, military and diplomatic relations to ensure that they don't entrench Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. And the truth is that if the government does do such a review, they'll find that even more sanctions will be needed to get Israel to comply with international law. So in my opinion, we need the scale of sanctions seen against Russia to be imposed on Israel. So the arrest warrants issued for war crimes must just be the start. They must form part of a wider package, including sanctions to force Israel to abide by international law, stop the war crimes, and end its illegal occupation of Palestine. Now, before I end, I want to make a point about what we're now fighting for. Of course, we're mainly fighting to save the lives of the Palestinian people targeted in Israel's indiscriminate war, fighting to save their human rights in the face of Israel's obvious crimes against humanity. But I think we're also now fighting to defend the entire system of global justice and human rights law, because when governments the world over permit Israel to tear up the rule book of international law and simply go unpunished, then there are real consequences. A world where such crimes are tolerated, a world where the international rules are applied only to those deemed our opponents and not our allies, all that is a world where anarchy replaces international law. It makes for a much more dangerous world. So by imposing widespread sanctions on Israel, our government will be taking a stance in defense of international law and making clear that Israel or any other state won't get away with trampling all over international law. Finally, on this United Nations Day for Palestine, I would urge our government to act now, act decisively, to recognise Palestine as a state. Given the context, that would send a powerful message that the UK is serious about ending Israel's illegal occupation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that message. I think we can all see from that contribution just how important the work of Richard in Parliament is, and Imran and many others in Parliament, in championing the cause of Palestine and the Palestinian people and holding the government to account. And I know it can feel demoralizing when we're witnessing the silence of political parties, in particular, you know, the government and the frontbenchers. But it is so important that we keep throwing our support behind voices like Richard's to enable them to do this work in Parliament and hold those people in positions of power to account. So thank you so much to Richard for that message, and I hope you all found that informative. Before I take us to our final speaker, I'd just like to invite anyone who hasn't already to use the Q&A function. Let us know where you're calling from, and let us know if you're coming to the demonstration tomorrow. Importantly, as Peter already talked about, very, very essential that everyone who can be there turns out on the streets of London tomorrow to protest and demonstrate for Palestine and to stop the British government sending arms to Israel. So let us know, pop your responses in the Q&A function. And then I'm pleased to introduce our final speaker for the day. Very fitting to introduce the co-founder of Labour in Palestine, the host of the event today. So our final speaker is Hugh Lanning. So Hugh, over to you.
Thank you, Jess. And like others, can I congratulate you on taking our message into the heart of the Labour Party, into number 10. Well done. It's the sort of individual act that we need to repeat across the whole world, actually. And it's UN International Day of Solidarity for Palestine. And you have to ask, really, how many more days of solidarity must there be before there is justice for Palestine? Year after year, the UN and most of the world passes motions and expresses solidarity. But if you are a Palestinian in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, or in the often forgotten refugee camps, not only does nothing change, it gets worse. Israeli violence and expansionism is not just tolerated, it is supported with the means, arms, money, and support to continue unabated. The UN's excellent and much abused OCHA, which produces regular bulletins detailing the facts, the numbers of deaths and injuries, the incursions, the settler violence, the impact of the siege, on and on, month after month, for decades. The most recent bulletin by them details a huge spike in settler violence coinciding with the olive harvest. Since the occupation, the Israelis have destroyed more than 1 million olive trees as a deliberate policy to try and undermine one of the planks of the Palestinian economy. It is not a question of facts. It is a matter of willpower. The war on Gaza continues unabated. Medical Aid for Palestine has produced a graphic showing how every single hospital in Gaza has been affected by Israeli attacks, by its military onslaught, not accidentally, but targeted. There are now over 2 million people starving in Gaza. Global inaction cannot be explained by normal political inertia or by Western guilt that dictates uncritical support for the Israeli state and everything it does. Visualizing Palestine in its latest graphic describes it as APR, anti-Palestinian racism, a racism that silences, excludes, erases, stereotypes, dehumanizes or defames Palestinians and their supporters. It denies, distorts or silences Palestinian narratives, as was seen most recently with the distortion surrounding the attacks on Palestinian supporters by the so-called Maccabi football fans in Amsterdam. The response to the ICC ruling by the US and other governments that it equates Israel with terrorism is based on the notion that a Palestinian life is not worth the same as an Israeli life, that an Israeli murderer is not really a murderer, that somehow history can justify current war crimes, more insidiously, that Palestinians are somehow lesser beings. Israeli propaganda seeks to dehumanize them at every opportunity. If Palestinians were regarded and treated as equal human beings by Israel and the West, the colonial war on Palestine and the occupation would have been over long ago. The ICC ruling and the issuing of arrest warrants is a very important step. It makes it harder for Western governments to ignore Israeli actions. Signatories are under an obligation to detain for trial those identified as possible war criminals by the ICC. So where does that leave the Labour Party and the UK government? Whilst we all suffer from the Trump blues following the US election, the arrest warrants should provide a golden opportunity for Labour to put clear water between itself and US foreign policy. However, it has succumbed to anti-Palestinian racism, as much as both the Republican and Democratic parties have in the States. Many years ago, they were described not as parties, but as gangs of political speculators. That is what the Labour Party has become on Palestine, a coterie of donors, officials and advisors prepared to gamble with people's lives for the sake of political advantage and power. And their actions, which they would fervently deny, are fundamentally based on a racist view of Palestinians. They treat and regard them differently because of who they are. Ignoring the hundreds of thousands now, a year later, millions of people who have marched in support of Palestine, Labour has placed itself and the determination of its policies beyond popular reach, immune to the views of its members, the public or global opinion or international law. Our challenge on the UN Day of Solidarity is to commit to bringing Labour and the government back within popular reach. When I was able to visit Palestine, in greeting you warmly, Palestinians would politely say, "Nice to see you, but what are you doing in your own country?" We can't de-elect Trump, but we can focus on trying to make Labour and the UK an independent voice for Palestine. Not an easy challenge. Israel, in losing global support, has cowed the political establishment into silence, not just out of fear, but out of self-interest. On the back of the massive support for Palestine the past year has shown, we need to build inside and outside the Labour Party, rejuvenate within the trade union movement, on the streets and in the churches, build a solidarity movement and an alliance for Palestine capable of bringing down the political walls of indifference, of bringing the Labour Party back within popular reach, capable of responding to and listening to what the people say. Social media can help, but we need to be apostles of the Palestinian story, going out to friends, family, work colleagues, to anyone who will listen. Telling the Palestinian story. In the US, the JVP, the Jewish Voice for Peace, have produced toolkits about how to talk to family and friends about Israeli genocide, about the demand for an arms embargo. This is a conversation we all need to have. Whilst Netanyahu and his settler government are trying to silence Haaretz and its critics at home and abroad, we need to speak up. We need to transform Labour into a voice for peace rather than being a supporter of war. Let's hope that in a year's time, we have been successful in not just having a commiseration UN Day of Support, but one of celebration, where we've actually succeeded in changing the view of the UK government and bringing more justice to Palestinians. Thanks for your support. Please sign up to Labour in Palestine so we can keep you in touch, and look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Thanks so much for joining us and, as always, for hosting this event. I know as Labour movement activists, everyone on this call who stand with the Palestinian people internationally, our job here is to continue raising awareness and to continue to speak up in solidarity with the people of Palestine. So that means sticking to the streets, including this Saturday's demonstration. And as we've heard, more than ever with the Trump administration poised to take over, but even with a Biden administration continuing to send billions of weapons to assist Israel in its genocide, we cannot allow this UK Labour government to cowardly follow the US in their path of destruction. The Labour Party was elected to be the workers' voice in Parliament and not the arm of Washington in Westminster. And that's a message we must make absolutely clear to our Labour representatives. So tomorrow, once again, we will take to the streets. I will be there. I know most of our panelists will be there. Please don't give up. Please make sure you turn out and tell everybody you know to turn out. Our government, in their complicity, we must not allow them the luxury of silence. We don't have the luxury of inaction or to become demoralized into inaction. So we won't be silent in the face of an occupation of apartheid or genocide. We will be out campaigning, yes, for Palestinian lives, but also for Palestinian freedoms, future, security, and justice. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to all of our speakers. And thank you, of course, to Labour and Palestine volunteers for organising and for the Arise Festival volunteers for helping hosting this event. I hope you've enjoyed this special lunchtime event. Thank you and solidarity, and I will see you all on the streets.